And joining us now, ABC News political director Rick Klein. Once again, Brandeis University history professor and ABC News contributor Lee Wright-Rigueur, PhD Department of Justice official during the Trump administration. Sarah Isgur is back with us, and CEO of the Progressive Political Action Committee, Democracy for America, and ABC News contributor Yvette Simpson. Welcome to all. It's an all-star panel there. And Rick, let me just start with you. So what did you make of how Brad Raffensberger handled the discussion, not just of the voting rights law, but of that's the epicenter of why the urgency around this. Trump tried to steal the election, and he was the first target. What do you make of his interview?
Terry, I think it's an important point to keep in mind in the context of the day that the efforts to try to reform voting rights laws at the federal level remain almost entirely partisan, relegated to the Democratic Party. And when you hear people like Secretary Raffensperger and also Governor Kemp and Lieutenant Governor Duncan, who all endured Trump's wrath and continued to do so by saying that the election wasn't stolen, none of them stood against the changes that were proposed and are now the law of the land in Georgia. And that has been the pattern in almost every state that has gone ahead and made changes in the wake of the 2020 election. Whatever the inspiration, whatever the motivation of people involved to try to introduce those laws, and many of them were inspired by the big lie and people that continue to wrongly assert that President Trump was robbed of the election. The specific cures for that have mostly been supported by all Republicans. And that issue of ballot access has been breaking down party lines, just like it is now in Washington. And we go into today knowing that Democrats don't have the votes. We a lot of focus on the Democrats that aren't on board, and that's a big issue for the rules change. But they get almost no Republican support. And even people like Mitt Romney, Senator Mike Rounds, who was on TV over the weekend criticizing President Trump, they all oppose these changes as well. And the fact that part of it hasn't been solved at the federal level to bring bipartisanship on board is telling, it's striking, and it may be determinative in terms of the fate of the legislation.
And Sarah Isgur, let me go to you on one of the things that Rick said, which is that really this is all Democrats right now, and even Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican of South Dakota, who came forward over the weekend and said, look, President Trump lost. He said it again. Trump went nuts on him on his issued a statement condemning him this way, 6 ways from Sunday. And yet Mike Rounds recognizes, as does Mitt Romney, that they are in a minority. Most Republicans in office, federal or state, won't stand up and say the mathematical fact that Donald Trump lost the last election. Do you see that changing at all? And is that really one of the problems in making any progress on voting reform?
So I actually think the voting reform conversation is really different from the who won the 2020 election conversation, which, just to be clear, Joe Biden won. Those Republicans who are saying so are simply correct. And those that aren't, I think, are waiting to see whether Donald Trump's endorsement in the primaries and in these general elections carry the same weight that they did before. We'll see. But there's a reason that Mitt Romney, Mike Rounds, all those people who you said were so courageous and standing up to the big lie are not supporting these voting reforms. It's because that's about the federalizing of state elections. On the one hand, I've worked in 3 presidential campaigns overseeing legal teams. It was my job to come up with any way a bad guy could steal a statewide election, to make enough votes, steal enough votes, change the numbers. Couldn't find a way to do it. So on the one hand, Republicans are just wrong about that. All of the ideas that they have so far have been wrong. Trump judges have said they're wrong. But on the other hand, Democrats who have talked about voting suppression aren't listening to academic studies. 2 just out of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote these up a couple months ago, said voter suppression efforts haven't had any effect on voter turnout. The people who want to vote, vote. And by voter suppression, we're talking about things like voter ID or in-person voting and only 2 weeks of early voting instead of 4 weeks of early voting. Those things don't really make a difference. And so when Democrats are trying to nationalize our voting rules instead of allowing states to make them, that's where Republicans across the board are having a problem with this. It has nothing to do, in that sense, with who won the 2020 election.
Isn't the Voting Rights Act of 1965 nationalizing the federal elections across the board because the Congress at that point saw a problem, stepped in, and federalized election processes? They couldn't use literacy tests and things like that to deny the vote to minority voters. I'll come back to you on that because I do want to ask Yvette Simpson, to be fair, your perspective on what this is about. Yvette, I wanted to go to you. People want to vote, Sarah says, and that this is really an effort to take over elections.
There are a lot of people making a lot of rules to make it harder for people to vote. So if that was true, I don't think we would have pages and pages of legislation that popped up this year as a result of Republicans realizing that if they don't cheat, if they don't keep people from voting, they don't win. And so I think that's the argument. You know, I heard your questioning of Brad Raffensberger. Terry, you did a great job. But what he didn't talk about was the hundreds of thousands of mostly black and brown voters that he purged from the rolls, which is why we want a longer lead time on applications and a longer lead time on getting ballots to people. He didn't talk about the fact that as early as a month ago, certain counties, mostly black and brown counties in Georgia, are already talking about consolidating and eliminating voter locations. He didn't talk about that. He didn't talk about the fact that hundreds of thousands of people don't have the type of ID that Georgia is requiring. And so even as he's talking about how great the system is, there are still attempts and real attempts being made to keep black and brown voters from voting. He also didn't talk about the disparity in wait times between black precincts and white precincts. So help me understand this. If a vote is a vote and it doesn't matter, why do we need so many laws, especially when in the face of very little real voter fraud that actually happens? And as you questioned him, acknowledging the fact that this election didn't reveal any new issues around voter fraud, people who were not registered did not vote in large numbers. We didn't see people coming out and voting more than once, all the things that you typically see when people are raising the alarm around changing voting laws. What this is about suppressing the right of black and brown people to vote. And you're right, the last time Congress took action on that was because that was happening. It was happening a lot in the South. It was happening a lot in Republican-controlled areas, and we're at that moment again. And so the federal government needs to act. We need automatic voter registration. We need to make sure that people who have gotten absentee ballots in the past automatically get ballots. We've seen this work in Colorado. Mail-in needs to be the way. And they need to make as many drop boxes available as we can. We also need to make sure voters aren't purged. So there's a lot to do. And if Brad Raffensberger was about enfranchising the vote, he would be doing more work to allow more people to vote more often and not restricting people and certain types of people from voting in certain instances.
Passionately said. I want to go to Leah Wright-Roger. Leah, as you look at this issue, so critical to the heart of the democracy, how do you weigh President Biden's leadership on this? The activists are frustrated with him. How do you look at it as a historian, as somebody who studies this issue? How's he doing?
So I think one of the things that we're going to see from Biden and we're going to see in the speech today is an acknowledgement that voting rights is not just a moral issue, but underneath all of that, it's also a strategic issue. And so I say this in that there is a certain kind of core morality around the idea of accessing the right to vote, the idea of expanding democracy from people who have been marginalized and put to the side of the democratic process, the very fundamental democratic process that defines, part and parcel of elected officials in this country. So even as people are turning out, even as people are participating in the vote, their access to that vote, to that fundamental entitlement or right, is something that is being constrained. And so we're going to see a lot of points about that. We will also see a number of things that point to kind of Biden will refer to history. He will refer to kind of Jim Crow, segregation, the actual need for a Voting Rights Act in 1965, why it comes about, and couch it in kind of moral terms, because this is the argument that that activists and protesters on the ground have been using. Strategically, though, this is something that is very popular with Democratic voters. We know that Democrats on the ground, that even people who feel alienated from the Democratic Party, but who consider themselves to be left, people of color that are voters, things like this, see this as a seminal issue, a really important issue. Strategically, it makes sense because it is also an area where Biden can push in and say, this is a figurehead, or this is a key point of my administration and my moment, my administration and of my agenda, and I am fighting for you. So I think it's instrumental and strategic in terms of bringing people around the agenda and suggesting to people that he is working towards things. And I think this is key, and it's really important because we know that activists, people on the ground, and Democratic Party voters have been very, very frustrated with Joe Biden and his agenda. And so Biden coming out and speaking for voting rights, but also speaking in favor of a slightly modified end to the filibuster will be crucial. And I think gathering some momentum around this, around an administration that has been really plagued by frustration and alienation.
He has his work cut out for him, that's for sure. So Rick, Yvette, Sarah, Leah, thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.